Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe now for the latest ancient history news and independent research from around the world. On April the 15th, 1912, 4 days into a maiden voyage from Southampton to New York City, the Titanic, the unsinkable ship, sank in the North Atlantic Ocean. The ship hit an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on Sunday, April the 14th, and by 2:20 a.m. the following day she was gone. More than 1,500 people lost their lives, and the survivors were eventually picked up and taken to America, where their stories were published in local and national press. But on May the 12th, 1912, less than a month after the Titanic sank, the Washington Post ran this peculiar headline: Ghost of the Titanic. Vengeance of Hoodoo Mummy followed man who wrote its history. The associated article starts by asking, quote, was the avenging spirit of an Egyptian priestess who died in the holy city of Thebes 1,600 years before the birth of Christ present upon the Titanic, pursuing with immortal malevolence those who had desecrated her tomb and her memory? End quote. It is a bizarre claim, and now it's a strange part of Titanic folklore. But where did this story begin? And why did it appear in print so quickly after the ship sank? In Philip Vandenberg's 1973 book, The Curse of the Pharaohs, he writes that a Lord Canterville wanted to take a mummy of a priestess who lived during the reign of Akhenaten from England to New York. This female mummy was apparently wrapped with the usual amulets and artefacts, but one of them contained a curse. The mummy was encased in a wooden crate, and because of its value, it was not placed in the hold of the Titanic, but actually behind the command bridge, close to the captain. He writes that many scientists who handled mummies showed clear signs of mental derangement, and he wonders if the Titanic's Captain Smith was a victim of a mummy's curse. In the 1991 book titled Unearthing Atlantis by Charles Pellegrino, he too writes about the curse of a Titanic mummy, but the details are actually quite different. He says that several parts of Queen Hatshepsut's mummy case were sold in Egypt to a British Egyptologist. With misfortune following the Egyptologist, and with people around him dropping dead, the pieces of the mummy case eventually ended up in the British Museum, before it was agreed they would be shipped to America. They were loaded onto the Titanic for a maiden voyage, and well, the rest is history. So although the stories are different, the common denominator is that there was either a cursed mummy or mummy case on the Titanic when it sank. It really is a bizarre story. To really get to the bottom of this folkloric tale, I needed to find the source. So this week I've looked through newspaper archives from April and May 1912, and I did come across a handful of articles regarding the Titanic that mention a mummy's curse. The first I could find appeared just 5 days after the disaster, a story in the Syracuse Herald titled Survivors' Stories Unanimous Tribute to Heroic Conduct. In the article it says the distinguished journalist and publicist William T. Stead died on the Titanic, and how one surviving passenger mentioned him. The article says, quote, according to this nameless passenger, Mr. Stead, believing there was not the slightest danger of the Titanic foundering, returned to his stateroom and probably perished there. Frederick K. Stewart, who sat next to Mr. Stead at the table, said the latter had told him of a mummy in the British Museum. This mummy had amazing adventures, said Mr. Stead, but any person who wrote its story would end in a great calamity. He said that while he knew it, he would never write it. End quote. The Washington Post article from May the 12th adds more, saying that William Stead probably did relay the full story of the cursed mummy to Mr. Stewart, while sat at their table on the Titanic. The newspaper speculates that Stead probably learned of the cursed mummy from the August 1909 English edition of Pearson's magazine, which printed the full story inside. After looking through old newspaper archives, I now went on the search for the August 1909 English edition of Pearson's magazine. And, I love the internet, I found it. I found the story that Stead probably told on the Titanic. The article starts by saying, quote, "The strangest ghost story of 10,000 years. How a malignant influence has haunted an empty mummy case, now at the British Museum ever since the mummy which it contained was removed over 60 years ago." End quote. To get the gist of the story, I'll give you a condensed version now, but I'll leave links in the description below if you want to read it in full. For a start, there is no mummy. The author calls it a cursed mummy case. And it's this one, which is actually a wooden mummy board and is still on display in the British Museum. The article says it was the cover of a nameless Egyptian woman who lived in Thebes 35 centuries ago, with her long hands crossed upon her breast and her dark eyes staring strangely forward into vacancy. The author says it's 18th dynasty, and it has a dark and mysterious history that has been called the strangest ghost story in the world, and it will never be written in full. It says that about 1,600 years before Christ, a priestess of the College of Amun-Ra lived and died in the mighty city of Thebes. She was either royalty or at least had some high rank, as her body was embalmed with great care. The mummy was enclosed in its wooden shell and placed in the appointed burial place of the priests and priestesses of the college. Writing in 1909, the article says that 60 years before, the mummy was separated from its case and it disappeared. Apparently, in the 1860s, a party of 5 friends went to Egypt from England and met with a local who had found a mummy case of unusual worth. One member of the party, called Mr. D, in the article purchased it, but the party agreed to draw straws to determine who could keep it, and that was someone the article calls Mr. W. But then the curse took hold. One of the members of the party was shot accidentally in the arm, the gun exploding for no reason, and then the arm had to be amputated. Another member of the party died in poverty within a year, and a third was shot. Another lost part of their fortune and died soon afterwards. When the case arrived in England, it was given by its owner, Mr. W, to his married sister who was living in London, who would then suffer large financial losses. Famous clairvoyant Madame Blavatsky came into its presence and declared there was a malignant influence in the room, and she begged the owner to send the mummy case away, declaring it to be a thing of utmost danger. The object was then sent to a photographer in Baker Street, and on taking its picture, the resulting portrait showed the face of a living Egyptian woman staring out with an expression of malevolence. Soon afterwards, the photographer died suddenly. The object was then sent to the British Museum, but the carrier who took it died within a week, and the man who assisted met with a serious accident. A Mr. B. Fletcher Robinson apparently recorded these events and wrote all about the curse, and then he died a few weeks later at an early age. The object has remained at the British Museum ever since, and it's still there today. The newspaper seems to be implying that William T. Stead was the next on the priestess's hit list for telling the story on the Titanic, and so he, well, the priestess, was responsible for the sinking of the ship. The Washington Post says that Stead was interested in the supernatural, the occult and spiritualism, and although they also record Stead saying that a sinister fate apparently meets anyone who writes about the priestess, the newspaper does speculate by saying, quote, "Stead did not say whether ill luck would attend the mere telling of the story, but it is difficult to see what distinction the malignant priestess would make between the written and spoken word." They continue. At any rate, a few hours after Stead related the gruesome narrative with obvious respect, his body lay lifeless beneath 2,000 fathoms of water. End quote. So, the Washington Post is arguing that the fate of the Titanic on April the 15th, 1912 could be because William T. Stead told a story he had probably read in Pearson's magazine, which, to be honest, is a pretty sick thing to print less than a month after the tragedy. The story was repeated in the Grand Forks Evening Times on Thursday, May the 16th, and then in the San Antonio Light on May 26, 1912. But this one article in the Washington Post does seem to be the source of the story, an embellishment of the account that was published in the Syracuse Herald days earlier. Being a distinguished journalist and newspaper editor, Stead would have known of the story of the cursed mummy case in the British Museum, and he was probably just telling people what he had read in Pearson's magazine. It was a great conversation starter for sure, but I think that's all there is to it. The details of the account in Pearson's magazine can't be corroborated, so make of the story what you will. The mummy board in question is apparently still on display in the British Museum, and the museum does have a webpage on the object, which I've linked below. It's known as the unlucky mummy due to the folklore around it, but it's just a wooden mummy board with painted detail on plaster. It's not 18th dynasty, but actually dates to the 21st, around 950 BC. It does come from Thebes, but according to the British Museum, none of the stories of misfortune have any basis in fact. There are no inscriptions on the board to identify the deceased, but great care has clearly gone into its production and decoration. So that's what we know, and later versions of the story, such as those by Philip Vandenberg and Charles Pellegrino, look to be fictional embellishments on the old story. They've added their own artistic license, but they have no credible source for their claims. So, there is no evidence for an ancient Egyptian artefact on the Titanic. No shipping records for an Egyptian mummy, mummy board or sarcophagus. The story comes from a Titanic survivor who was apparently told by Frederick K. Stewart that William T. Stead told him about the mummy's curse, the one that was published in Pearson's magazine in 1909. It was then embellished by the Washington Post, who said the mummy's curse could be the cause of the sinking of the Titanic, and the story has been embellished more and more ever since. Some early British Museum publications do describe the lid as belonging to a priestess of Amun-Ra, although we don't know how true that really is. We do know it was donated to the museum by Mrs. Warwick Hunt of Holland Park, London. Interestingly, it was donated on behalf of Mr. Arthur F. Wheeler in July 1889, which amazingly must be the Mr. W that was mentioned in Pearson's magazine, so maybe there is some truth in the legends. Although stories and tales abound, there is no real evidence the mummy board is really cursed, and we can't corroborate any of the tales of woe. Maybe it is cursed, but maybe it's not. I guess that all depends on if you believe in the supernatural. All I'll say is that I personally don't think the priestess was responsible for the sinking of the Titanic. Still, after I've now told this story to a mass audience, I might just be extra careful for the next few days. You know, just in case. Because some believe the spirit of the priestess is still around in London, haunting the tunnels of the London Underground Central Line, moving from the now closed British Museum station to the now open and very busy Holborn station. Next time I go to London and visit the British Museum, although yes, I am a rational person, I do think I'll take a taxi. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.